Another big cultural thing during the 1920s is the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Klan has a rebirth in the 1920s. In 1915, William J. Simmons held a ceremony at Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is just outside Atlanta. So the Klan is rebirthed in the 19 teens and then really grows during the 20s. But this Klan is different. We call this the second Ku Klux Klan. It basically is from 1915 until World War II. The first Klan was right after the Civil War. So the first Klan basically stayed in the South, but the second Klan operates in the South, the North, and the Midwest. So it's kind of a continental movement, I guess you could say. In addition to targeting blacks, the new Klan targets Catholics and Jews. They tend to support prohibition. They also attack monopoly, big business, and Wall Street. So they kind of have populist overtones to their kind of message. Now, within a year, Simmons had gotten the Klan to a membership of 100,000. These were 100,000 due-paying members. The second Klan, like I said, lasted until World War II. Now, the second Klan has some internal fights, and Simmons ended up getting deposed in 1922. Two men, Hiram Wesley Evans and David C. Stevenson, took over, with Evans becoming the Imperial Wizard, so kind of the leader of the Klan. David Stevenson basically operates the Klan in Indiana, and then Hiram Evans operates the Klan from Georgia. So under their leadership, the Klan grows to some 5 million members across the country. The Klan helped elect numerous House and Senate members, as well as governors throughout the nation. In all, about 75 members of Congress owed their seats to help from the Klan. Now, the Klan has marches in Washington during the 1920s. They had a massive march in 1925 when they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and then to the Washington Monument. It was estimated that 30,000 Klansmen took part in this march. So this is kind of their high moment. But in just a few years, the Klan basically breaks up and their numbers shrink to maybe a few 100,000. A number of scandals rocked their leadership. A number of Klan members, Klan leaders in states were arrested around the nation. David C. Stevenson fought with the Imperial Wizard Evans. He gets expelled from the Klan and sets up a rival Klan in Indiana. But in 1925, Stevenson commits kidnapping and rape, and then ultimately murder. He kidnaps and rapes a school teacher named Madge Oberholzer. She had bite marks all over her body, and her breasts bled because of the biting that Stevenson gave to her. She attempts to kill herself by taking a bunch of pills, but she fails initially. She coughs up blood. She basically is dying. She ends up dying in Stevenson's care. He refused to get her medical help after she tried to kill herself, and because she eventually dies, he's charged with her murder. Stevenson is convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. One of the things the Klan argued is that they were very, kind of, this is weird, but they were a family-friendly organization. You know, marriage is very important. Don't be a criminal. Don't drink. You know, be an upstanding citizen. That's kind of the message they gave to the nation. But, you know, they murder people throughout the nation. They intimidate blacks and other people, and a lot of them are not morally pure. They commit, you know, very atrocious, or they commit atrocities, and stuff like this kind of shows that. So when stuff like this happens, kind of the veil is torn away, and people see them for what they really are, and basically membership plummets. After Stevenson is convicted of murder and the Klan starts to kind of be shown for what they really are, which is a cruel organization, Coolidge gives them a famous rebuke in 1925. This is what he said: "Progress depends very largely on the encouragement of variety. Divine Providence has not bestowed upon any race a monopoly of patriotism and character. Whether one traces his Americanism back 3 centuries to the Mayflower or 3 years to the steerage, we are all now in the same boat." So one of the things the Klan said is, we don't like immigrants, we don't like Catholics and Jews. And Coolidge says, look, if you've been in America for hundreds of years or you just got here a few years ago, that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Now we're all in the same boat, so we have to treat each other with respect and equality and have the same sense of justice towards everyone. Now, the 20s seemed like a decade of gangster violence, consumerism, flappers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but religion still holds a high place for many Americans. Two of the most colorful religious figures in the 1920s were Aimee Semple McPherson and Billy Sunday. And the biggest controversy involving religion was the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. Now, Aimee Semple McPherson, she's a Canadian. She's born in 1890. She had married and traveled with her husband as a missionary to England and China, but he ends up dying in Hong Kong. So she returns home to Canada with her child. She ends up having a near-death experience at a young age, and she basically becomes a traveling evangelist. She, with the help of her mother, travels around Canada holding revival meetings. She later comes to the United States and opens up a huge megachurch in Los Angeles called the Angelus Temple. She started something called the Foursquare Gospel Church, and she basically preaches at her church and holds revivals. She does a lot of things like opens up soup kitchens and shelters for the homeless. But she also has kind of a Hollywood-like atmosphere at her church. Her church is very beautiful. It has very expensive decorations, and she dresses kind of in a very Hollywood-esque sort of way. Now, her life's not without controversy, though. She remarried and divorced twice after the death of her first husband, even though she told people they shouldn't get married, or they should not divorce and remarry. In 1926, she went missing after taking a swim off Venice Beach near Los Angeles. There was a frantic search for her, and it was thought that she died of drowning. But a month later, she showed up walking near the Mexican border. She claimed to have been kidnapped. Now, her story sounded strange to many people, and some thought that she ran away with a married man and had an affair. She was hauled before a Los Angeles grand jury by the district attorney Asa Keys. But mysteriously, all the charges are eventually dropped. Some thought she paid Keys off to drop those charges. She goes back to her church. People still follow her, but she ends up dying in 1944. Her church, though, still continues to this day. The most famous preacher of the 1920s was Billy Sunday. Now, he had been a famous baseball player for the Chicago White Stockings. That's what they were called before they became the White Sox. Now, his father had fought in the Civil War and fell sick and died, so Billy Sunday was raised in an orphanage in Iowa. Now, when he became older, he was a very wild man. He was an alcoholic and a womanizer. He did these things openly. But one day he was attending a revival, and he said that he publicly accepted Christ as his Savior, and he quit womanizing, he quit drinking, and then he gave up his baseball life. Now, he was making about $400 a month, which is a huge sum back then. So he's very wealthy, and he gives up that lifestyle, and he becomes a preacher. He's very energetic. You can kind of see these pictures. He likes to shadow box with the devil, kind of pretend style when he's preaching. He would jump up on tables and podiums when he talked. He's very energetic, very outgoing. It's estimated that he preached to over 100 million people throughout his 50-year career. Now, the most famous religious event of the 1920s is the Scopes monkey trial. In the 1920s, there's a culture war, much like today, over the teaching of the theory of evolution in schools. What should schools teach about the origins of life? Now, Tennessee had passed something called the Butler Act in 1925. It made it illegal to teach anything that denied the story of creation found in the Bible. The founders of this town called Dayton in Tennessee, they got together at the social center of the town, the Robinson Drugstore, kind of like the old guys who drink coffee at the gas station. And they basically thought up an idea. What if we could get someone to violate this law and create a lot of controversy and then get a lot of attention on our city? It would be great for business, they said. They had seen an advertisement in a local newspaper by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to basically challenge this law. So they went to a local high school teacher named John Scopes, and they asked him if he would be a test case for this law. He taught evolution. He agreed, and he broke this law and was arrested for it. So basically there's this trial that takes place in Dayton, Tennessee. The famous journalist H.L. Mencken, he's the one that called it the monkey trial, so that's kind of how it gets its name. And it should have just been a small trial, not a big deal, but reporters from all over the nation come to this little town. The atmosphere is like a carnival. There's hot dog vendors, people selling souvenirs. There's real life monkeys in cages and monkeys walking around the town. There's all sorts of other attractions. The famous defense attorney Clarence Darrow came to defend Scopes, and William Jennings Bryan, the famous presidential candidate and the great commoner, he comes to Dayton and works for the prosecution. Now, the trial would have just been boring and clear cut, but William Jennings Bryan took the stand to defend the Bible against Clarence Darrow's critiquing questions of it. So basically, you have this famous presidential candidate get up on the stand, and he's asked these questions about the Bible by Clarence Darrow. And it's kind of interesting because Clarence Darrow voted for William Jennings Bryan as president, so the two had a lot of similar ideas. But he asked him these questions. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Scopes is found guilty and fined $100. But then the newspaper called the Evening Post, or the Evening Sun, pays his fine, so he doesn't have to pay it himself. Shortly after the trial, William Jennings Bryan dies in Dayton, Tennessee. So this trial is kind of a focal point of the culture wars in America. Another thing that kind of was culturally significant, culture war ish in America, was kind of the new women of the 1920s. That's what women often called themselves, was the new woman of the 1920s. The woman of the Gilded Age was called the Gibson Girl. Now, the Gibson Girl wore clothing that covered herself. She was very modest. She had her hair piled up on her head and had very straight posture. She wore a tucked-in shirt with a skirt that went down to the floor, so you can kind of see from these pictures what the Gibson Girl looks like. Now, the new woman of the 1920s is called the Flapper. The Flapper is totally different than the Gibson Girl. She demands the same social freedom for herself that men had. Flappers flaunted conventional social norms. They drank and smoked in public. They attended speakeasies and nightclubs. They flirted openly. The Flapper bobbed her hair, wore bright lipstick, wore tight-fitting clothes, put on a lot of makeup, had short skirts and flesh-colored pantyhose. They wore unbuckled galoshes or boots. That's actually where the term flapper comes from. The term originates in Britain, and it was applied to girls in the World War I era who wore these galoshes or these boots unbuckled, so they would kind of flap when you walked in them. So that's where flapper comes from. The movie star Clara Bow is a good example of a flapper. You can kind of see these pictures, what she looks like. So she's a good example of a flapper. In the 1920s, there was also kind of this movement called the New Negro Movement. The Harlem Renaissance is kind of wrapped up in this. You know, in the 1920s, blacks still deal with a lot of segregation and discrimination, and they basically work on ways to kind of deal with this, how to process this. Some groups, like the NAACP, still work through the legal process to end Jim Crow, but others take a different approach. Probably one of the most famous black leaders in the 1920s is Marcus Garvey. Now, he was a Jamaican immigrant to the United States, and he was impressed by Booker T. Washington's call for blacks to uplift themselves and improve their own lives. Garvey kind of preaches this black nationalism and separatism. You know, blacks they'll have their best lives when they have their own nation and they kind of watch out for themselves. They don't need to be a part of America because America probably won't ever accept them. So that's kind of what Garvey teaches. He would travel around in military garb, and he even had his own militia and his own flag for this country he supposedly wanted to start. In 1914, he founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, this group operated a cooperative grocery stores throughout the country. They had laundries. They had a publishing house and restaurants. They had a daily newspaper called the Negro World, and this was the most widely read black newspaper in America. Marcus Garvey also had a ship company called the Black Star Steamship Line, so he would take black goods and business produce and travel around and sell them. It was kind of a source of pride for his organization. He started sort of a Back to Africa movement among blacks in the United States. He looked for places to found a country so that he could take blacks from America back to Africa and start this country. This kind of brings him into conflict with blacks who are more of the NAACP opinion. A lot of blacks, even going back to the Civil War, argue, why should we leave? This is our country too. We're not from Africa. We're from the United States. This is where we were born. So there's kind of this split in the black community about how to deal with these issues in America. The NAACP is of the opinion, we're from America. This is our country too. We're not leaving. So they actually oppose Garvey in a lot of his things he does. Now, ultimately, Garvey maybe didn't handle his business dealing so cleanly. He's convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And then after he gets out of prison, he's deported to Jamaica. Now, during the 1920s, you also have something called the Harlem Renaissance. This explodes during the 20s. It's basically an intellectual, social, cultural, and artistic movement that occurred in Harlem, Manhattan, among the black community. This is where poets, writers, jazz singers, and musicians and intellectuals gather to kind of talk about issues that face black Americans and to be creative. One of the most famous spots in Harlem was the Cotton Club. It's this jazz club and speakeasy that provides music and alcohol. Whites attend it, but most of the entertainment is done by blacks. One of the most famous poets of the Harlem Renaissance was Langston Hughes. He publishes The Weary Blues in 1926. It's basically a collection of poems that kind of capture the essence of the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance. He states in one of the poems that I am Negro and beautiful. So kind of this sense of black pride. We're creating a lot of our own poems, novels, literature, kind of intellectual thinking. So we have a lot to be proud of. Other Harlem Renaissance writers such as Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and Jesse Faust explored the black experience in their writings and stories. They wrote works of fiction representing this. Augusta Savage used sculpture to capture black accomplishments. Zora Neale Hurston wrote short stories and novels. So everything from Marcus Garvey to the Harlem Renaissance, to blacks finding new forms of expression and outlet. This is kind of referred to as the New Negro Movement. That's what they called it during the day. There's lots of different forms of entertainment in the 1920s. Sports were very big in the 20s. The American Football Association, which is later becomes the NFL, was founded in 1920. But baseball and boxing were probably the most famous sports. Babe Ruth was the most famous baseball player of the 1920s and maybe the most famous athlete. He's famous for his home run hitting. He set the record for career home runs at 714. That lasted forever. His most famous moment was when he called his shot at the 1932 World Series. It was in the third game against the Chicago Cubs. Ruth had 2 strikes on him, and he pointed to the center field fence before the next pitch was thrown. Once the pitch is thrown, he crushed a home run over the fence and kind of created a legend. Jack Dempsey was one of the greatest boxers of the 1920s. The fight of the century took place in September 1927 between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. An estimated 50 million people listened to the fight on the radio. Jack Dempsey thought he should have won this match because he knocked down Gene Tunney, and the referee took too long to count to 10, so this is sometimes called the long count. So Gene Tunney was knocked down, probably stayed down for more than 10 seconds, but because the judge took too long to count, he got back up and fought Jack Dempsey for many more rounds, and then they ended up giving the bout to Gene Tunney. Movies are very popular in the 1920s. At first, movies didn't have sound. One of the first greatest movies was The Great Train Robbery. This was made in 1903. It didn't have sound. But in 1927, the first feature-length film that had sound came out. It was called The Jazz Singer. I've got some movie clips you can watch of it. Famous movie stars of the 1920s included Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin, and the German Shepherd dog Rin Tin Tin. Jazz music also became very popular during the 1920s. The 1920s is called the Roaring Twenties, but it's also called the Jazz Age because of this music. Jazz was originally a vulgar word for a sex act, but jazz music becomes very popular. It's based off of emotion and improvisation. Now, jazz began in New Orleans, but soon it spreads to Chicago, New York, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. The best known jazz performers of the 20s are Ferdinand Morton, Louis Armstrong, Edward Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith. People also read a lot during the 1920s. The Book of the Month Club was started in 1926. Some of the most famous authors from the 20s are Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and T.S. Eliot. If you ever want to read something that kind of exemplifies the 1920s, read F. Scott Fitzgerald. Basically, all his books are about young people who are wealthy, who have empty lives, don't really know what to do with their lives, so they just spend all their time partying and drinking, very empty lives, and then there's usually a great tragedy and everything comes crashing down. That's kind of what F. Scott Fitzgerald's own life was like. So these are the more intellectual writers, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Eliot. They try to write serious novels with big themes and ideas. The writers of the 1920s are called the Lost Generation. Basically, after World War I, they basically look at Western civilization and they say, what good is civilization? We almost killed ourselves during the last war. So they kind of reject all the values of the pre-World War I era. Now, they're not the most popular writers, though. They don't really sell very many books. People like Zane Grey, Gene Stratton Porter, and Harold Bell Wright, they write less serious novels that are more for entertainment, and they sell much more than these serious writers. F. Scott Fitzgerald, his book This Side of Paradise sold about 50,000 copies, which is a lot. But then Harold Bell Wright's The Recreation of Brian Kent sold 1 million copies in the 20s. So some of these other writers, Americans like to read much more. Now, the most famous celebrity of the 1920s was Charles Lindbergh. It's not an athlete, it's not a writer, it's not a musician, it's an aviator. Charles Lindbergh was born in December 1902. Now, he had a rough childhood. His parents separated when he was young, and he's enrolled in lots of different schools. He's always kind of going to a different school. Once his father, who is a congressman, he takes him to an air show, and the young Lindbergh falls in love with planes. Now, as a side note, his father was a congressman from Minnesota. He runs for governor of Minnesota during World War I. He opposes American entry into the war. He doesn't think the war is good for America. And I want to read you a quote. This is what Charles Lindbergh's father said. "If you are really for America first, last, and all the time, you're a class that's pro-German by the big press, which are supported by the speculators." So remember that when we get to World War II, Charles Lindbergh is going to echo the America first sentiment of his father when Hitler is on the march in Europe. Now, Lindbergh's not very good at school. He flunks out of college, but after that, he enrolls in flying school, and as they say, the rest is history. He worked as an air performer. He would walk out on the wings or do stunts in planes at county fairs. He bought his own plane and would teach people how to fly. He once flew a minister in a wedding that occurred up in the air, and one time he flew a man up in the air who wanted to be flown over his own town so he could urinate on it. So kind of some weird stuff. What makes Lindbergh famous is his nonstop flight from New York to Paris. Now, nobody had flown this long of a distance before solo over the Atlantic Ocean. This flight took 33 and a half hours. It was over 3,600 miles. He flew the trip by himself in the plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. It was named that because his financial backers were from St. Louis. So he takes off from New York and he lands in Paris. When he lands in Paris, 150,000 Frenchmen greet him. President Coolidge sends a naval cruiser to bring him back home. Once he comes back to America, he goes to New York City and is given a ticker tape parade, and some 4 million Americans cheer him on. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and in 1927 he became Time magazine's first person of the year. Charles Lindbergh reinforced the idea for America that, there is this self-made man. His courage, self-reliance, and dignity inspired others. So Charles Lindbergh is the first, or the most important celebrity, I guess you could say, of the 1920s. So that's kind of the culture of the 1920s. Now we're going to start getting into the Great Depression and the 1930s.